everybody, welcome to Cars, etc., a show about cars and a whole lot of other things, but specifically more about classic cars. And of course the show is brought to you by altcointrader.co.za. Go on there, register for free, and you can start your cryptocurrency trading and find out a little bit more about that. Today we're talking about a South African favorite, a brand that is so well known in this country. And it is said that Mr. Karl Benz is the pioneer of the first ever, engine that ever produced for motor cars. Joining me in the hot seat today is Steffan Liebenberg. Steffan, thanks very much for joining you. Is it right to say that Karl Benz was the guy who sort of invented the combustion engine?
Absolutely. So he was responsible for the first ever motor car, as we self-propelled motor vehicle, as we know today. He basically built it in his backyard. And his wife, Bertha, was the first or the pioneering lady that went for a test drive without his knowledge. And
first woman driver?
Yes, first woman driver. She went on a 90-kilometer run.
Oh, that's amazing.
With this car and with her two kids to go and visit her mother whilst Karl was out, or I don't know where he was at the time. But anyhow, so they took this jalopy on a run, and on their way they got stuck because the fuel quality in those days were obviously not great, and the carburetor had an issue. So she took her hairpin and she was able to unclog the carburetor, and they made it back without too much of a problem.
That is just the most fascinating story.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And then the other story, Mercedes, that was one of his daughters. Is that correct?
Mercedes was actually the daughter of a guy by the name of Emil Jelinek, and he was a very wealthy entrepreneur, and he was one of their financial backers, and Mercedes was his daughter's name. So that's where the
Mercedes came from. See, I was always under the impression that it was Karl Benz's daughter.
Yes, I know.
Oh well, there we go. That's why you're in the hot seat. Okay, let's start off. Antique and vintage cars in South Africa. I mean, as I mentioned in the intro, Mercedes is such a strong brand in South Africa.
Correct.
Always has been, worldwide, but also in South Africa. Do we have a lot of antique and vintage Mercedes-Benz still in our country?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, Sasha. The interesting part about it is that Mercedes in East London, so there's a manufacturing facility, and they've been producing cars since the 50s. So cars that came in as sort of semi-knockdown units and that were constructed here. And as a result, we actually have a very big Mercedes-Benz classic community and quite a good survival rate as well. So there are many cars that are still roaming around and being loved and cherished all over the show.
And those kind of cars, 50s and even prior to that, that might have been brought in earlier or whatever, also very sought after.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the South African auction records actually is held by a 1937 Mercedes-Benz that used to belong to the German consulate in Cape Town.
Wow.
And it was one of those special vehicles, as you say, that came into the country, and it's now in the Rupert's Museum in
Franschhoek.
In Franschhoek, yes.
You touched on something, and I think it's very, very important. Mercedes manufacturing and assembling cars in South Africa. I mean, if it wasn't for Mercedes-Benz, East London most probably wouldn't be a town.
Quite right.
And they still are there, and huge investment in South Africa, which is a great, great thing.
Absolutely. The world's C-Class production is happening in East London. So the C-Class is...
and that's fully manufactured? Fully
manufactured in East London. And the quality is really fantastic. I mean, there was an article written some time ago about the W123 series Mercs, those 80s Mercs that we still see on our roads today. And the author actually compared the South African assembled cars to one that was assembled in Germany. And the South African car, the quality of assembly is actually much better than the ones that came from Germany. So it really is, I think it's something to be proud of.
And I must echo that sentiment as well, because if you travel in Europe and specifically Germany, also even in France, a lot of the taxis are Mercedes-Benz.
Quite right.
And it's quite amazing. You get into one of those, and yes, it's a taxi that's been used quite a lot, and you get into a South African spec of the same kind of style, and it is remarkable how much better our quality is.
Quite right.
And maybe I think South Africans are very, very particular, especially when it comes to Mercedes-Benz.
Yes. And I think the story of Mercedes-Benz in South Africa is also an interesting one. So in the 50s, there were a lot of tariffs on imported cars because we were a British colony, and they were obviously trying to protect, British cars and the sale thereof. So there was big duties and tariffs on German cars especially, and they were selling in the early 50s probably about 100 units a year.
Wow.
So compared to today, that's almost laughable. But they found a way around the duty problem, and that was that the same duties didn't apply to commercial vehicles. So they did a bit of a stunt. They brought in half cars, so it was basically just the front sort of section of the car with nothing at the back of pontons, and then they constructed bakkies locally. There was a company called Moorware Industries in Germiston, and they made the back section of this little ponton bakkie, and that's how the South African Mercedes story started. And this was a very commercially viable enterprise, and those bakkies were sent all over the country, and I think they sold about 400 in the end. And their survival rate was quite low because the farmers obviously used them till they fell apart. But and today it's a very collectible asset. People are finding them in bonds and that kind of thing, and they're reviving them, and it's unique to South Africa.
Very, very. That's a fascinating story. You mentioned farmers, and I've got to go into what engines were in those pontons.
Diesels.
Okay, now, because me growing up, and sometimes you'd venture out, and most of the areas just outside of the main city centres were farms.
Sure.
And you'd see one or two bakkies, but then I'd see Mercedes, Mercedes after Mercedes in these turbo diesels, and this was like the farmer's greatest car.
Absolutely. Now, just interestingly enough, those weren't turbo diesels. They were normally aspirated diesels.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're definitely not quick.
They weren't getting 0 to 100 very, not SLS kind of pace.
Definitely not. But what they will do is they will rock up 500,000 kilometers.
That's the thing.
With no issue. And those cars were renowned for their build quality. They were really over-engineered, and they could really tackle a farm road or a dirt road like a bakkie, and there are actually some of them still roaming around today. Some of them a bit tatty, but still, still going. And I think that really sort of started the love affair between the South African and the Mercedes-Benz brand, because most of us have memories of uncles on farms with dirt roads and those old 300Ds. Mostly cream in colour.
Yeah, basically sort of that's the colour they're going to be, and it's a 300 diesel, and there we go.
100%.
That's what it is. But it was just so fascinating that this was the choice of vehicle for our farmers.
100%.
Quite amazing.
Yeah, I think it had the unique ability to cope with dirt roads, to run on the same diesel that you put in your tractor, and you could take it to church on a Sunday because it had a bit of prestige.
Yes, and it was a Mercedes.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go on to slightly prettier cars.
Yes.
From the 300D, the Gullwing.
Right.
The Gullwing has got to be one of the most iconic designs, beautiful cars that Mercedes has ever made.
Quite right.
Where did it come from?
Yeah, Sasha, I think the Gullwing is an interesting story. As I'm sure you're well aware, Mercedes in the early 50s were racing champions of grand proportions. and they had phenomenal success with the SLR, which was a racing version of what we commonly call the gullwing, also with gullwing doors, and those cars were really hitting the lights out. And there was a guy in the States that was doing distribution for Mercedes, and somehow he convinced Mercedes management that they needed a road car similar to the SLR. And he must have been quite a convincing guy, because
not easy to convince the Germans in anything.
and as I'm sure you know, up until that stage, post-war Germany was a pretty drab place.
Sure.
So they weren't selling sporty cars. The only thing with a mildly sporty character was the 300S, which was actually just a big two-door version of a sedan. So this was a big leap for them. But they designed that, or they took that racing DNA, and they made a road-going car with a space frame tubular chassis, a 300 SL motor that was fuel injected.
Yeah.
One of the
in
first
the 50s,
sports cars and they created something that is, I think it was gobsmackingly beautiful when it was launched. And 70 years on, almost 70 years on, it still has that magnetic appeal to it. And it was very expensive when it was new.
Of course.
So, it was the plaything for the rich and famous. But interestingly enough, one of the examples that went to the UK actually went to the RAF. And the reason why they bought one is to take it apart to see how it works.
Oh, really?
Because fuel injection was like that magic in the 50s,
Unbelievable.
So they bought one in order to see how does this thing really come together. And today, of course, it's a car that is very, very collectible.
Do any of them ever come up on the market?
In South Africa, we only have one gullwing, one coupe.
True gullwing.
Yes, and that is also at the Franschhoek Motor Museum. And there are, as far as I know, 11 roadsters in private ownership
in the world.
300 SL in South Africa.
11
roadsters. Yeah.
Wow.
So one coupe and 11 roadsters.
Okay.
And the roadsters sometimes come up for sale, but at staggering
sort of kind of prices. I mean, and I suppose you're going to get international people who are going to bid on this.
Absolutely.
Because if it's £1 million,
yes,
it's 20 million rand.
Well, that's
but it's only £1 million rand. I mean, £1 million pounds.
Yeah, so in the
only
region of
£1 million,
18 to 20 million.
Is that so? That's where the number is at the moment.
Yeah.
Wow, that's. I mean, it's just still a magnificent car. I agree with you. What is the difference between a pagoda, and a gullwing?
That's also a good question. So in the evolution of the SL, if you see the gullwing and its roadster,
there we go, doors open.
So
this
way.
One
with, yes, and then the open top. So those were the first real SLs, followed by the 190 SL. So the 190 SL was really the little baby brother.
Okay.
It had all the looks, but it was based on a very humble ponton chassis with a 4-cylinder motor. So, it had all of the show, but none of the go, really. So it was more aimed at females, female drivers at the time.
Really? Okay.
And it was at a much lower price point. And then you had the 300 SL that was more of the man's car and more of a racing car. So it had a bit of that racing pedigree to it. And then when the time came to replace both of those cars, Mercedes chose to replace both with only one car, which is the Pagoda.
Okay.
So the Pagoda was a sort of a very nice compromise between something that was a hairy-chested, sort of a very macho racing car, and a boulevard cruiser. So it was sort of in the middle.
Beautiful car, though.
It is stunning. Designed by a Frenchman, can you believe it? And an iconic look. I think it's a timeless design.
I mean, I've seen a few in South Africa, and a friend of mine's mom actually drove one, and every time I just saw this car, I just couldn't believe how beautiful it was.
Yes.
Are there quite a few of them around?
There are quite a few of them around. When I'm done with this, I'm going back to my panel beats as we're assembling one at the moment.
Oh, really?
Which is great fun.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, there are quite a few around, and The magic about the Pagoda is it's not just a stunning car to look at. You can actually drive it regularly.
Okay.
So it's a six-cylinder.
Even being that old, I mean, it's still
Absolutely. You know, it's a fuel-injected six-cylinder. The later ones, the 280s, had disc brakes all around. So it's actually a fast, comfortable car. It can brake like a modern car. It can keep up with modern traffic. Values are obviously quite high, so you know it's probably not a car that you would drive every day, but you could if you wanted to.
and it's a Mercedes.
And it's a Mercedes,
There we
so it
go.
doesn't break down.
It's not going to break down. Now, the 600
Yes.
Grand Mercedes, which is like a limo.
Yes.
And yes, I know that, you know, one was owned by Hitler, and I think Mussolini had one, you know, the real nice people of the world in that time. But just a fascinating vehicle. I mean, did Mercedes decide to make these for diplomats, presidents, prime ministers? What was its heritage?
Yeah, the 600 has an interesting history. So there were big Mercs before the 600, and one of them was called the Adenauer. It was a 300.
Okay.
And Konrad Adenauer was the Chancellor of Germany at the time. And he was so devoted to his 300 that it followed him everywhere. So wherever he went all over the world, the 300 would come along. And that's why it got that nickname. But it was a big, stately sort of a car. And it was beautifully made, and it's a very pretty car. But in the late 50s, it was already a little bit outdated if you compare it to some of its rivals, you know. So especially in the States, it had a 300, so it's a 3-litre six-cylinder, which was laughable compared to one of those Cadillacs with almost a 7-litre capacity. You know? And even in the UK, a Cloud 3 was a V8, and it had one up on the Merc. So Mercedes decided that they're going to make the ultimate in luxury, and that was the 600. And why it was the ultimate in luxury is the engineering was just so far ahead of its time. You know, it was a V8, so the first time that Mercedes had a production V8 in a car, 6.3 litre capacity, fuel injection, and it had pneumatic suspension. But besides the suspension, there were all sorts of other gadgets that also worked on the same principle. So the seats, for example, were also pneumatically powered. So were the windows. So was the sunroof. So if you sit in a 600 and you operate any of these things, it's dead silent. It just slides open and slides closed without the sound of a motor anywhere. They all
Remarkable.
had aircon. They had it was really well ahead of its time, and I think they really wanted to prove a point, and so they did. And in the early 60s, it was a wow. And
were a lot of them made?
In the region, well, less than 2,000.
Okay.
Yeah.
And are they in demand?
Usually so. They are still in demand. They were definitely the car of dictators back in the day. Dictators show people. Elvis Presley had one, and
Incredible.
And of course the state. So many of them went to the state. And today they're hard to come by. You know, there are very few of them around.
Mm-hmm. And those who have them, I assume, not going to
not for sale.
Not going to go anywhere.
No, so most of them are in collections, and it's a very costly car to restore. You know.
This is where okay.
Yes.
Well, I mean, listen, with all of this pneumatic technology,
Quite right.
I mean, something goes wrong there, it's going to cost you a fair penny.
Absolutely, a window switch on one of those cars is 40 grand. Just to put what you say into perspective.
All right, well, there we go. Just the window switch.
Just the window switch, because it's actually a pneumatic valve. It's not a switch like you and I know.
So if you do find a 600, make sure that everything works. Otherwise, Steffan over here can fix it for you at a tiny little sum. Something like that.
Something like that.
Okay, let's move on. The W114 series, the W115 series, with those big lights in the front. And when they came out, also, you know, quite stately.
Yes.
One has to say, quite a stately car. And then they sort of disappeared. But I've noticed that all of a sudden people are wanting to bring those cars back? I mean, are we seeing that there's this recovery of those vehicles, that people are saying, you know, Steffan, find me a W114, W115, I want that in my collection?
Absolutely. You know, Sasha, I think one of the main drivers for collecting classic cars is nostalgia.
Yes.
And a lot of us had those cars as student cars, or you remember a relative having them back in the day. And for the longest time, they were worth very little money.
Yes.
So many of them served as third cars, as the bucky, as the, you know, and weren't cherished. So their survival rate as a result was not that high. And today, very clean examples are definitely worth collecting. And there is a demand for them.
Okay.
They also came out in a very pretty coupe. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
Probably not.
But it's a rare sight in South Africa.
Okay.
But it was the first E-Class coupe. So for
right.
Mercedes, it was quite a big step. And those are today quite rare and valuable.
What, I mean, if somebody comes across a W114, 115, what are you sort of paying, you know, looking to pay that it's gone through the mill, it's got 500,000 kilometers on it, but it's still a Mercedes and the bodywork's still good, etc. What would you pay?
It's a very nice entry-level classic. So it's a nice car for a youngster to learn about mechanics and that kind of thing, because we have very basic, simple motor cars. I would say, you know, entry-level is probably in the region of about 70 grand for one that is licensed and running and that kind of thing, but that needs work. And then they would probably go right up to around 200 for one that is now really perfect.
Good.
Yeah.
Somebody finds one for 70 and says, hey, Steffan, look what I've got over here. You give it a once over. And the guy says, I want it, you know, nice and clean and neat, and, you know, that I can use it as a daily runner. Is he in for 100, 150?
No. You know, it all depends on what level you want to go to.
Correct.
But just to get them mechanically up and running and so that they're good and serviceable, not at all. No.
So I mean, it's a really decent vehicle to look at.
Absolutely.
If you want to get into the classic car market.
100%. I would say it's a nice starter classic, and the parts are relatively available. Okay. You could still find a lot of the parts with the agents, amazingly enough.
And also the wonderful thing about it is that it is an iconic car. I mean, if you're a youngster and all of a sudden you rock up in your Mercedes, you know, 114, you know, people are going to stop. They're going to look.
Absolutely.
Beautiful car. Speaking of beautiful cars, one of my favorite Mercedes ever built was the 190E.
Right.
You know, I think, and then it went into racing and DTM and those kind of things. But it was just so different. It was much smaller than everything else was out there, but it had the 16-valve engine in it. Was there reason, were Mercedes now at a stage going, we need to get back into racing again? What is the reason for that car?
The reason is unfortunately much less glamorous. So, so Mercedes in the early 80s were concerned about economy. They had a program called Cafe, and that was the main focus was getting cars with low emissions, better fuel consumption, so that they were more accessible to the world. And you know, they were still reeling from that world crisis of the 70s, and they realized that the days of these bigger is better kind of cars are numbered. And of course in Germany, as you pointed out earlier, the taxi industry is a mainstay of Mercedes in terms of clientele. So I think that also prompted them to develop something as an entry-level Mercedes that was more affordable, but that had the ethos of a Mercedes, you know, well built, and that can last forever. Now, interestingly enough, the guy that designed the 190E is a gentleman by the name of Bruno Sacco, an Italian designer that used to work for Mercedes in the 80s and the 90s. And according to him, this man designed SLs and S-classes and all sorts of interesting cars. But he is famous for saying that the 190 was the crown of his tenure.
Oh, wow, really, eh?
And I think one of the reasons is because it's such a challenge to take a big car like an S-Class,
Yes.
and really make it compact, and make the design still work. And this design was obviously very successful because that paved the way for the C-Class as we know today.
Correct.
So
Correct.
I think commercially it was also a fantastic success.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a great story because I mean, I just remember tracing one out. You know, I was like, and I've never been a massive Mercedes-Benz fan, but I mean, I have appreciation for all kinds of vehicles. And the 190E just stood out. I was like, wow, you know, this just looked sporty and whatever. And now knowing the sort of background to it, it sort of like goes, I'm going to stick with my sporty story. Something like that. Mercedes, the SL, the SLC range, you know, the 450 SLC. I mean, just beautiful to look at, and you know, then there was, and there are various derivatives. I remember mainly in South Africa the 450 SLC. I think there were 350s and 280s and all of that kind of stuff. And that was, you know, that was now the ultimate sport luxury car for Mercedes in the late 70s, 80s,
early 80s.
Yeah,
quite right. And for a limited time, they were actually manufactured in South Africa or put together in East London, the SL and the SLC 450s.
Sure.
And it was the most expensive listed car in the country at that time.
Is that so?
Yeah, I think something like 31,000 Rand would buy you a new SLC.
You look at those prices today, Steffan, you go, oh, take us back to those days, but in today's climate.
100%. You could probably buy a house in Sandton or an SLC in 1980.
I'm sure.
But yeah, and amazingly, they really survived well. There's still a number of them on our roads. And it's a car that was once again over-engineered to the extent that, you know, they can last forever.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
They were very, very special. The SL, we've got to talk about, because if we look at the big marks that we've been talking about you know, on these programs, Magnum with the Ferrari 308, Miami Vice with the Ferrari Testarossa, the Cannonball Run with the Lamborghini Countach, Dallas, Bobby Ewing, red 380 SL.
Absolutely.
I mean, it just became iconic. The whole world just wanted a Bobby Ewing car.
Yeah, you know, my business partner owns a red 450 SL, and in the service book in the front, under colour, it says Dallas Red.
I mean, that's just amazing.
So that was definitely the car to have in the early 80s. And I think that is also the reason why they sold so well in South Africa. And they still have that connotation. If you see a red 107, it's called the 107 series, you immediately think of Bobby Ewing. Bobby Ewing's one was a 380 SL.
That's a 380.
And there were a few sold in South Africa, a few 380s, not that many as in the States. But yeah.
I mean, just fascinating, because I mean, that's long before the days of product placement in TV shows or whatever. They must probably just sat there and said, oh, Bobby, let's put you in a Mercedes. Little did they know what it was going to do for the brand.
100%. And for that specific car, you know, it was launched in 1971, that 107 series, and they built it right until 1989. So besides the G-Wagon, it was the longest running series, and it was practically not changed. You know, the shape is consistent throughout those 19 years.
Unreal. You mentioned G-Wagon. Got to talk G-Wagon, because the new G-Wagons, got to be the most over-engineered car in the world, for the pure fact that people drive it from their house to the restaurant.
Yes. And it wasn't designed to drive from the house to the restaurant. Hey?
Okay, that's enough on G-Wagon. I think that's enough on that. The S series of Mercedes, and you know, you most probably can take me back to the 50s or 60s, but if I go back to the most probably mid 80s or somewhere around there, when the S series came out, that was the benchmark of luxury. And we've got to exclude Rolls-Royce and Bentley and those things, but if you wanted to know where the future of cars were going, you looked at the S-Class, and specifically, I don't know what the first models were, but I always relate to the S500.
Yes.
Am I right?
Quite right. So the first time that the term S-Class was used was with the W116 series that arrived in 1973.
Okay.
And from there on, you know, it really was the pinnacle of luxury, and I think it still is. You know, it's the one to watch, and I think they have very stiff competition these days. You know, the Audi A8 is a force to be reckoned with. 7 Series, BMW and Lexus is always on their heels. But I think it's still the car that, you know, if you want to know what the future's going to look like, what motoring's going to look like in 10 years, go and drive a new S-Class.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I mean, we see all the derivatives that come out. So you got the S63 and but that S500 or S600, that still to me is the benchmark. I mean, I always wait for the new one and go, okay, what gadgets are in here? Because then I go, all right, this is how far everyone else is behind. I mean, the evolution, the technology, the R&D in Mercedes-Benz is extraordinary. I mean, they must be working on things that we wouldn't even dream of.
Quite right. And you know, I remember reading a car magazine article as a kid where they tested a new W126 500 SE. And the guy that wrote the article was brazen enough to compare it to a new Rolls Royce. And he said, wow, you know, if you have to compare the two cars like for like, the Merc would score better. But it's because Mercedes has an R&D budget second to none, and probably 3,000 people working in Stuttgart on this one project versus the 6 people working in crew on the Rolls. You know,
fair point.
So,
yeah, I mean that's a fair point. Okay, we spoke G-Wagon, we've done that. SUVs,
yes.
Huge in the marketplace, huge worldwide.
Quite right.
I get confused because there's a GLE, a GLC, a GLD, then there's a GLA. There are too many of these cars out there. But they seem to be very popular.
They are. And I think, you know, what is happening is Mercedes has sort of mirrored their sedan series in, so there's a GL version of every sedan. So a GLA, GLB, GLC, GLE, GLS, etc.
Okay.
It is confusing. And I think there will come a time when a lot of the sort of 3-box sedan as we know it will disappear,
yes.
and we will go strictly into the SUV route.
SUV, okay.
Sad as that might be.
Yeah, but I suppose, you know, eventually you're going to go, as you say, so we've got an A-class SUV, a B-class SUV,
exactly.
C-class SUV, and you're going, actually, we just need one for those 3 and one for these. So
100%.
It just makes economic sense.
And considering the state of our roads, I think a SUV makes sense.
Well, it does make sense as well. Yeah. Is every Mercedes-Benz an AMG?
That is something that I find confusing myself.
Okay, good. I'm glad, because I thought when I was sitting there and going, I'm going to ask this question because I don't know.
But the short answer is, so there is an AMG division,
yes,
that designs AMGs that have amazing performance, wonderful looks,
okay,
and etc.
I think we get that
right.
side.
So that side we know. But then there's also an AMG package, which you could order a new C-Class and say, I want the AMG package. That doesn't do anything to the performance of the car, but it makes it look wild. So they put nice wheels on.
Skirts.
Yes,
exactly.
Oh,
I see.
So that is where the difference comes in.
So you've got your C180 AMG.
Yes.
It looks like a
rocket.
Like a rocket, but it's still a C180.
Quite right. Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. The new cars, today we've spoken about the SUVs, the SLS, the GT. Technology, I mean, abounds. The performance, I mean, nobody knows where these cars are going to eventually go to. I mean, how fast can they go? Sure. Do they hold their value? Are they as sought after as other, you know, marques who make supercars and hypercars?
You know, Sasha, I think there's a following for any of the cars that you just mentioned, but specifically you mentioned the SLS, and a tip for anybody that wants to buy a modern classic Mercedes, look at the SLS Coupe. So that's the one with the gull-wing doors. Mercedes, that's the last gull-wing that they will ever make, because legislation in the US for a whole host of reasons, prevents them from making another one. And that's one of their biggest export markets. So it's not financially viable for them to create another one. And those doors, it's iconic, it's stunning, it's mesmerizing, and it reminds you of the 300 SL.
Yes.
And we can already see that the values are on the up.
Okay.
So they already have collector status. There are many of them hiding away with low mileages, and there's a very good reason for that. So that is definitely one to watch.
Okay.
And I have no doubt that as far as the rest of the range is concerned, there will always be a need for one in superb condition, a collector wanting a GT in his stable, with low mileage, etc., etc.
It makes a lot of sense. Mercedes have a tremendous history in motor racing. Of course, we had the tragic incident of Le Mans, which they pulled out, and then came back into motor racing, DTM first, and then of course into Formula One. The last 10 years, I mean, they've been unparalleled, untouchable in that sphere. This must have been incredibly dramatic for the brand, where all of a sudden they're going, well, we might as well just make more super hot cars, AMG, but real AMG cars, for the pure fact that win on Sunday, buy on Monday.
Quite right. And I think, that is also the reason why we see something like the Black Series.
Yes.
AMG. So AMG started off as an external party to Mercedes. Mercedes then later bought the brand over. So it was an in-house arm of Mercedes-Benz. Sporting arm.
Yeah.
But there's always the need for more exclusivity. And the Black Series is actually quite a recent sort of a development. So I think the first Black Series cars came in 2006.
It was a C55 or something.
I think SLK 55.
SLK 55, Black Series.
Black Series.
So that's just a limited edition.
It's a limited edition car, and it really focuses on reducing weight, in combination with the latest, greatest AMG motor, and then you basically create this absolute rocket
ship
at an astounding price point. So,
yes.
So they are rare. They're very rare in South Africa. I would say that every single one of them are already collectible. So it's definitely the one to own if you're an AMG guy.
That's the one. Get the Black Series.
Get the Black Series.
Mercedes over the last 10, 15 years have gotten involved in a whole lot of different aspects. As I say, motor racing, Formula One, DTM, they withdrew from there and then they went into Formula E racing. They've been in Formula E, they've won in there as well, and they're pulling out, I think at the end of 2022 into 2023. The world seems to be going very EV, electrified. What do you think Mercedes are looking at if you look across their whole range of vehicles? Are they a manufacturer that would consider going completely electric?
Sasha, it's a very good question, and I think the answer is sort of multifaceted. I think in the developing world, EV is still
unsustainable.
I mean, if you just look at what we are facing on a daily basis in South Africa in terms of Eskom and its woes, I don't think an EV car is really a prospect at the moment.
Yeah.
In the next 20 years, yes, most definitely. But I think for now, no. And we have to consider that Mercedes is big in the developing world, in India, for example, in Africa. So I think a complete turn to EV is probably not in the cards in the foreseeable future.
Yes.
But as far as Europe is concerned, it's definitely heading that way. And also, unfortunately, we have seen them discontinuing the V12 motor, which is so sad.
Tragic.
Really tragic. And you can see the move away from big V8s into more compact V6s with massive turbos. That's already starting to happen. So you could see where it's heading. Unfortunately, I think the internal combustion engine is, who knows how.
Please don't say it's not. Please.
How long the future is. I'm glad that we're in the developing world and not in Scandinavia, because I think they're.
More than likely, you're going to get knocked over as a pedestrian because you can't hear the damn car.
100%.
It's a big worry, this. Worries me.
Don't
Steffan,
buy Tesla.
Yeah, there we go. Don't mention that. The last one I'm going to throw you at Project One. Mercedes have built this hypercar, specifically for the Lewis Hamiltons and the Valtteri Bottas of the world, and now I assume the George Russells. They're going out to the public, limited edition. I mean, if you look at that kind of car and the hypercars that are coming out, the technology in there is most probably technology that we are going to see 10, 15 years down the line, which is small engine,
yes,
1600, V6, electric, hybrid technology. That's the way I want to see the cars go.
And
talk to someone.
That is definitely where they're heading at the moment. Is a keen sort of somewhere in between a Tesla and where we've come from. A happy medium, So I think for the foreseeable future we will see more of that. And yes, I mean, it is part of Mercedes' DNA to use the hypercars and F1 and that kind of thing to really develop their prowess in terms of engineering for Joe Soap and his C-Class to eventually also see some of that technology.
Phenomenal. Fascinating chat. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
It's been really, really brilliant.
Thank
Steffan Liebenberg is our gentleman, and I've learned a lot about Mercedes-Benz. That's another episode of Cars, etc., brought to you by altcointrader.co.za. Go there, register for free, and start your cryptocurrency wallet, or whatever it is you can start. Until the next time, take care. Ciao, ciao. Ferris Cars is a Ferrari specialist dealership in Sandton, Johannesburg. Since 2010, Ferris Cars has dealt in all things related to Maranello's finest, from classics to the contemporary. Sales, service, advice and exclusive events, Ferris either has it or has access to it. And of course, in partnership with Altcoin Trader, Ferris Cars accepts cryptocurrency and can even help you buy your dream car from any other dealership in crypto. Check out their website at ferriscars.com or follow them on all popular social media platforms.